Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Center. It is great to be back in the Bakke Auditorium this afternoon for our annual homecoming lecture and the first event of this academic year at the Wade. I wanted to give a special welcome to everyone joining us here and online, our continuing scholars, and of course, everybody celebrating a class reunion. Thank you so much for coming. This is a special year for the Wade Center, too. It's our 60th anniversary. So Clyde S. Kilby started the Wade in 1965. It also happens to be the 75th anniversary of the publication of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So it's a good time to pick up a copy of that book again. We have a great lineup of events planned for the year. On October 9th at 7 p.m. in Armerding, Tish Harrison Warren, the Anglican priest and writer, is going to be giving a talk on waiting on the slow work of God, how the habit of hope transforms us. So you're not going to want to miss that. On October 28th, we've commissioned a piece for choir and organ that will also be in Armerding. It's an evening of music, poetry, and art celebrating the wonder and witness of creation. And it's inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien's love of trees, with words from Wendell-Berry. And you won't want to miss our Christmas event, Christmas at the Wade, December 11th. In the spring, we have our Hansen lectures, which are going to explore the genre of fantasy literature. This talk today is also going to be exploring the genre of fantasy literature, but it would be a mistake to think of this talk as mere table setting for that talk. I guarantee that our speaker today will be doing much more than table setting. You're going to get a fantastical feast today. Our speaker is Professor Richard Hughes Gibson. He has served in Wheaton's English department since 2009. He's the author of 4 books: Forgiveness in Victorian Literature, Charitable Writing, Paper Electronic Literature, and The Way of Dante. And the last one of those originated from the 2023 Hansen lectures here at the Wade, which was on Dante, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, and Dorothy L. Sayers. We're going to be celebrating the release of that book in December at the Christmas at the Wade event. Dr. Gibson's current book project examines the intellectual origins of ChatGPT. Very excited about today. And Dr. Gibson has a special note. He would like to dedicate today's lecture to his dear friend and our beloved colleague, Jay Wood, whose death on August 9th came too soon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gibson to the Wade.
Well, thanks first to Jim for a warm Wade welcome. And thanks to you all for spending an hour of your precious homecoming attending an event with such a curious title. New-Heaven-and-Earthlings on the Warrant of Speculative Fiction. Except for the prepositions, conjunction, and definite article, you may have found this title befuddling, though I guess it must have been somewhat alluring because here you sit. So let's begin in proper academic fashion by defining our terms. The first half of my title derives from Revelation 21, in which John beholds first a new heaven and a new earth, and then even more spectacularly, their convergence. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man." Next, we come to warrant, by which I mean not an order from a judge to arrest someone, but the justification or authorization for something. In this talk, I want to make a case, at once psychological and theological, for why we may enjoy speculative literature. Speculative literature, though, what's that? A helpful explanation appears in the Australian computer scientist and writer Eugen Bacon's 2019 book, Writing Speculative Fiction. She defines it as follows, and she's speaking of fiction, I'm thinking a little more broadly of literature. Speculative fiction is the literature of unbound imagination, an umbrella term broadly encompassing stories that feature fantastical, supernatural, or futuristic elements. Tales set in, at, or on the fringe, teasing the peripheries of what if. Thus, speculative literature is a catch-all term that gathers sci-fi and fantasy, supernatural tales and futuristic ones, stories of hobbits and of Martians. Bacon also provides a helpful rationale for this big umbrella term when she locates all of these sorts of stories in the mental space that lies at the edge of what if. One more term. To explain what I'm attempting to do in this talk, and honestly, I'm not going to dwell at this for very long, but I just thought I should have a term. I'd like to label it speculative theology in parallel with my subject, speculative literature. It would be so neat. Alas, that term comes with all sorts of baggage that I have neither time nor inclination to unpack and sort through, so I'll just take advantage of this podium and coin my own term. In today's talk, then, I'll be engaging in speculative kino-ontology. The latter term stitching together ontology, which in academic circles describes the study of being with a capital B, theories about being, again, capital B, and ways of being, again, BBB, capital B, with the Greek word favored by the New Testament to describe things that are, that are novel, unprecedented, or new in kind, just as we hear our Lord say in Revelation 21:5. More simply stated, today I'll be meditating on how our reading may just draw us up to the periphery of the new condition promised at the Bible's end. Now, one of the most important lessons that I have learned in my 16 years of service at this fine institution is that announcing the plan for class up front not only helps students to understand how the parts fit together, but also offers reassurance to the first children in the room that I'm not just making it up as I go along. So here's the plan for today's lecture. First, we'll lay the groundwork for my speculations about speculative literature by listening to George MacDonald discourse on the purposes of the earthly imagination. This will be the longest section of the talk. Then we'll revisit J.R.R. Tolkien's famous list of the functions of fantastic literature. Next, I'll build on the lessons we've taken from MacDonald and Tolkien to offer 3 speculations about speculative literature. You might think of this as a flipped argument. I'll start with my reasons and evidence before sharing with you my highly debatable claims. Finally, I'll present far too quickly, and at this point it'll be minutes. So you know when the Lewis stuff comes, the lecture's wrapping up. 2 specimens from C.S. Lewis's speculative writing that model the paradigm I'm proposing. Sound good? Then away we go. Or maybe I should say, away we stay. For I invite you to consider for a moment the place where you sit. No doubt, architecturally speaking, the Wade Center stands out among its neighbors. But I'm not sure that those superficial details, superficial means on the surface of things, alert drivers and walkers by what a truly peculiar place the Wade Center is. I'm certain that I didn't understand this place until I installed myself in the reading room for several months to compose my Hansen lectures, and even then, the realization was gradual, that this building is a stone, brick, wood, carpet, and paper. Oh, so much paper. Memorial to and incubator of the imagination. In one word, the Wade Center is an imaginarium. Every single one of the 7 meditated long and wrote memorably in defense of the imagination. Alongside their professions of Christian faith, their devotion to the imagination marks them as an intellectual set in their milieu, makes the Wade Center collection make sense, if you will. Of course, the 7 didn't speak with a single voice about the imagination. Indeed, rare is the subject where they did. But we can see certain themes running across their work, such as the sense that imagination deals in something deeper than propositional truths and ultimately has a certain priority over reason. Or that imagination doesn't just turn sensory data into images, but finds or unveils the meanings within the images it confronts. Or that imagination revivifies the familiar, or that it may bring some new meaning into the world. Or maybe, just maybe, that the imagination is that quality that defines the imago Dei, since God too has an imagination from which issues time and space and worlds, and creatures to populate them. The authors whose works are collected here were at once interrogators and proponents of the imagination. They saw it as a faculty that we should cultivate in ourselves and encourage in others. And in this respect, the latter six, Chesterton, Lewis, Tolkien, Sayers, Williams, and Barfield, were following the lead of the Wade's eldest author, George MacDonald, who kindly left us an extensive blueprint of his thinking on these matters in the form of an essay titled The Imagination, Its Function and Culture. How convenient. Originally published in the British Quarterly Review in 1867, and then republished in an 1893 collection of MacDonald's prose writings, Dish of Orts, Lewis's copy of which sits right there. MacDonald begins the essay by taking on a classic view of the psychological end of education, to produce in students a certain repose, a certain self-possession, a certain tranquility in face of the slings and arrows of our earthly fortunes, achieved through the development of this and that faculty and the depression, if not eradication, of this and that other faculty. And of course, reason has always been on the right side of such formulations and imagination on the wrong. Their relationship in this way of looking at education, summed up by the Scottish philosopher David Hume's famous dictum, "Nothing is more dangerous to reason than the flights of imagination." MacDonald will have none of this. In his reckoning, our natures revolt against such enforcements and suppressions. Our faculties will assert themselves, if only in their hunger pangs. We will have imagination. Thus, he counsels that we recast our philosophy of education's end as the opposite of repose. That would be unrest, a noble unrest, an ever-renewed awakening from the dead, a ceaseless questioning of the past for the interpretation of the future, and urging on of the motions of life. If this noble unrest is our goal, MacDonald argues in turn, then the imagination is the very faculty that we should be most disposed to nurture, for it of all faculties is least content with the bare surface of things. He reverses the hierarchy of faculties, placing the imagination ahead of reason and intellect. To those who give priority to the material world on the supposition that humanity ought to inquire into the facts of creation rather than idle inventions, MacDonald replies as follows, in the words that I've emboldened. To inquire into what God has made is the main function of the imagination. It is aroused by facts, is nourished by facts, seeks for higher and yet higher laws in those facts, but refuses to regard science as the sole interpreter of nature, or the laws of science as the only region of discovery. The imagination thus doesn't take us away from reality, but drives us deeper into the heart of reality. It accepts facts. The Latin root means something done, or even a deed, as an invitation to pursue their doer. Later in the essay, MacDonald argues that scientific progress itself depends on imagination. For the imagination discerns possible structures and relations between things based on previous observations, then tasks the intellect with testing whether they are indeed the laws of the phenomenon. That's not a radical thought now, right? Scientists now are really interested in imagination, but it was arresting in the middle of the 19th century. But what is this imagination in which MacDonald places such high hopes? To begin, MacDonald says what we would expect a Victorian thinker to say. The word itself means an imaging, or a making of likenesses. A more scientifically minded contemporary might describe it as the mind's ability to pull sensory data together into a composite image. Yet MacDonald then takes a bold step beyond the ordinary conversation of the day, characterizing the imagination as, quote, that faculty which gives form to thought. Not necessarily uttered form, but form capable of being uttered in shape or in sound, or in any mode upon which the senses can lay hold. On MacDonald's telling, imagination is basic to the operation of our minds, translating inchoate thinking into forms that not only bring a kind of order to our thought, but allow us to communicate our thought to others. In light of what MacDonald goes on to say in the essay, I think we should understand imagination as, and this is my kind of summary, the faculty that finds correspondences between our inner life and the innumerable things of creation, creation with a capital C, and thereby allows us to meditate upon that inner life and to communicate it to others. Creation, to put it another way, furnishes the materials out of which to explain ourselves to ourselves, and the common media, if you will, out of which to articulate ourselves to others. But in saying all this, I risk getting ahead of dear George. Before we can grasp why he conceives of the human imagination in this way, we must first understand a few things about his conception of the divine imagination. First things first. For not only did he hold that God has an imagination, he also held, as you see on this slide, yes, you do, making sure, that the imagination of man is made in the imagination of God, and even more strikingly, that a human imagination lives and moves and has its being in God's imagining. Here, MacDonald would wish me to point out that there is also a fundamental difference between divine and human imagination, and that lies in the fact that whereas we make images out of materials around us, God makes the materials. Our imaginations deal in likenesses, his in real things. Where a man would make a machine or a picture or a book, God makes the man that makes the book or the picture or the machine. Would God give us a drama? He gives us a Shakespeare, and that's his spelling, not mine. And do note, I have a note here to point out that it's his spelling. MacDonald continues, as the thoughts move in the mind of a man, so move the worlds of men and women in the mind of God. And make no confusion there, for there they had their birth, the offspring of his imagination. Man is but a thought of God. Thus, we are surrounded by God's thoughts embodied as only God's thoughts can be, in substantial forms. And the lesson applies to us as well. We are God's living and moving thoughts, not only in our beginnings, but at this very moment, MacDonald would want me to point out. Aristotle taught that the prime mover, that origin of all things, spends eternity thinking of its perfect self. MacDonald taught that God thinks thoughts capable of thinking themselves. And our encounter with reality consists of thinking through God's other thoughts with which we are engirdled. Striving to explain how MacDonald came up with these ideas, scholars have pointed, with cause, to the influence of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's famous definitions of the primary and secondary imaginations in his Biographia Literaria, first published in 1817. The primary imagination, Coleridge argues there, is the basic power by which we perceive the world. This is a Coleridge quote. Quote, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. The secondary imagination, Coleridge calls an echo of that power, which breaks down and reshapes perceptions in order to recreate the world in the mind, a process especially active in art and poetry. MacDonald's emphatic statement of the priority of the divine imagination owes much to Coleridge, no doubt. Yet I suspect that MacDonald's thinking was equally, if not to a greater extent, led by Coleridge's friend and fellow romantic with a capital R, William Wordsworth, whose poetry MacDonald cherished. At several points in his writings, Wordsworth proposed a symbiosis between the world and the human mind, though nowhere so directly as these lines from the verse preface of his 1814 narrative poem, The Excursion. How exquisitely the individual mind and the progressive powers, perhaps no less of the whole species, to the external world is fitted. And how exquisitely, too, theme this but little heard among men, the external world is fitted to the mind. That the mind is exquisitely fitted to the world is an intriguing argument, though one need not get there theologically. One could make an argument on evolutionary grounds, for example, that the mind, or better, the brain in those circles, in its strengths and weaknesses bears the unmistakable contours of its environment. More daringly, Wordsworth would also rearrange the equation in order to advance the unconventional claim, then as now, that the external world is fitted to the mind. That formulation does not, as far as I can reckon, brook an evolutionary explanation. For this dual fitting, if you will, cannot be the consequence of chance or historical process, excepting, of course, the human imposition of its image on the world. That's not Wordsworth's point, though. He wants to see the snug fit between world and mind and world, as something that not that we made, but a pre-existing condition whose benefits we reap. This apparently true marriage of world and mind raises the question, of course, of who or what exactly arranged matters in advance. Wordsworth does not specify who that someone is here, though given his professional trajectory toward Anglicanism, we may hazard a divine guess at the correct answer. Decades later, George MacDonald was unabashed in his reply to the old poet. Well, of course, God did the fitting. Perhaps fitting, though, is not a strong enough word in MacDonald's case. Gifting would be more accurate. For MacDonald did not see the universe as assorted or stray divine thoughts, bearing no relation to each other, but a vast and coherent system of embodied thought. He took up Wordsworth's proposal that the world befits the mind because God made it so to suit our psychological needs. The world around us, he writes, and this is such a memorable line, is an outward figuration of the condition of our minds, an inexhaustible storehouse of forms whence we may choose exponents. And he ends, in the last words you'll see here, for the world is, allow us the homely figure, the human being turned inside out. In the passage that immediately follows those words, MacDonald argues that if you take any word expressive of emotion and you consider its origins, you will find that its primary meaning is of the outer world. The very word emotion originally described the physical experience of moving or being moved out, thus being disturbed or stirred up. In the swaying of the woods, MacDonald writes, the unrest of the wavy plain, the imagination once saw the picture of a well-known condition of the human mind, and thus arises our word, emotion. That wasn't just true in the past, that wasn't just true in the past. MacDonald's point is that we remain radically dependent on our sensory surroundings in order to explain our inner lives. Even the word emotion, once again, derives from the physical world. In so emphasizing that dependence, the imagination and the imagination's incessant role in helping us to give form to thought by drawing on the sensory data around us, MacDonald is not altogether unique. Though as far as I can tell, he was way ahead of the intellectual curve. To cite a recent example, Douglas Hofstadter's and Emmanuel Sanders' 2013 book, Surfaces and Essences, Analogy as the Fuel and Fire of Thinking, they write, the spotting of analogies pervades every moment of our thought, thus constituting thought's core. To put it more explicitly, analogies do not happen in our minds once a week, or once a day, or even once a minute. No analogies spring up inside our minds numerous times every second. We swim nonstop in an ocean of small, medium-sized, and large analogies, ranging from mundane trivialities to brilliant insights. For Hofstadter and Sander, however, analogy, the selective exploitation of past data to understand new, unfamiliar things, and under this heading they include metaphor, is a way of making sense of the chaos of the world around us. Analogies, moreover, are often only of temporary use, though some, such as those advanced by people like Albert Einstein, may point us to deeper truths. For MacDonald, by contrast, the imagination's dive into the world of forms is a raid on the storehouse prepared by God. Thus, the activity of finding correspondences between our inner life and the world is not innovative, but a kind of remembrance, the thinking of God's thoughts after him. Analogy is a providential exercise. In a commentary on Wordsworth's poetry, also included in A Dish of Orts, MacDonald stresses that nature is given indeed not only for our material, but also our mental welfare. God, he says, has put beauty into nature, knowing how it will affect us, and intending that it should so affect us, that he has embodied his own grand thoughts thus that we might see them and be glad. The natural world is, note the present tense, the flowing forth of God's heart, the flowing forth of his love for us, making us blessed in the union of his heart and ours. He sums up the lesson thus: if the world proceeded from the imagination of God, and man proceeded from the love of God, it is easy to believe that that which proceeded from the imagination of God should rouse the best thoughts in the mind of a being who proceeded from the love of God. This, I think, is the relation between man and the world. There is another side to the imagination's operation to which, due to today's theme, I must give short shrift. And that is that in addition to making use of God's images to help us think and communicate, our imaginations enable us to trace the divine imagination in whose image it was made. By contemplating, quote, what the Hebrew poets call the work of God's hands, we may come to understand the laws that govern the universe, for those are no less than the objects around us, expressions of God's imagination. So there's space for science in this paradigm, large space. The human mind's encounter with the world, we're thinking big picture now, is thus an opportunity on MacDonald's telling for movement in several directions. From outward in, translating the forms of our perception into the words and shapes and sounds that express our hearts. From inward out, using those symbols to speak ourselves to our neighbors. And from outward onward, into the mind of God. In this process, we may recognize our likeness unto the rest of creation, as we and the rose are both signatures of God's immanence, and, even more startlingly, our likeness to the great imaginer, God. You can understand now why MacDonald believed, first, that educators suppress the faculty of imagination to their pupils' peril, and second, that if imagination is given freedom to flourish, education cannot be about the attainment of repose. With such high callings and amidst such abundance on which to operate, how could the imagination do otherwise than cultivate a noble unrest? It all sounds so good, doesn't it? Wouldn't you just love to live in such a world? MacDonald, of course, would say that you do. As an 1868 review of MacDonald's works well put it, the universe for him beams and blazes with the light of God. Yet if we are being honest, for many of us, that beaming and blazing is intermittent. While we may grant that occasionally some image that comes to the mind, or we hear, or some struck chord we hear, or some brushstroke we make, feels as though it is not only lovely, but true in some lasting sense. For the most part, the metaphors we make, or analogies we throw together, seem of transitory value at best. And doesn't MacDonald's characterization of the storehouse of forms in creation seem to be rather too rosy? What about gnats, and viruses, and tumors, and earthquakes, and tsunamis? These, too, are things of this world, and while we may grant that they provide forms to explain ourselves, doing so calls attention to the bitter side of life in this world that is almost wholly absent from MacDonald's account of the imagination's function and culture. To read MacDonald's essay may, for some people, simply highlight the condition of estrangement from creation and creator in which they find themselves. Now, I have not dwelled so long on MacDonald's paradigm only to undermine it entirely. If MacDonald's picture of being an earthling appears only intermittently or rarely possible for some, perhaps all of us, that does not dispel its attraction as a picture of how things ought to be, or perhaps could be, if only creation, and more importantly our reception of it, could be renewed. If only a new earth and a new humanity were in the making. You can see what I'm hinting at, and to that suggestion I will return in a few minutes. First, however, we need to own up to the fact that for many, if not most of us, the world of our immediate experience is full of cracked sidewalks, thorn bushes, and dull, rainy afternoons. Trips to the mountaintop are infrequent. The limitations and disappointments of ordinary life drive us to look elsewhere, to other worlds, for nourishment. As the poet W.H. Auden observed in a 1967 lecture, dissatisfaction with the primary world of our experience is among the chief reasons why writers build and readers delight to enter secondary worlds. Auden suggests 5 principal human grievances against the world in which we find ourselves. This is my paraphrase. 1, while our arrivals to this world and departure from it are involuntary, our secondary worlds exist by choice and escape natural limits. 2, in life, our freedom is narrow. But in constructing secondary worlds, we are omnipotent, freely deciding what they will contain and what will happen in them. 3rd, our knowledge in this world is partial. But there we are omniscient, understanding not just everything that happens, but more importantly, why things happen. Fourth, daily life is often trivial, while secondary worlds concentrate on what is sacred, vital, enchanting. And fifth, evil and suffering are insoluble in life, but art can simplify them or imagine them away. Now, you know where Auden is getting his ideas. Not only the notions of primary and secondary worlds, but also the understanding that secondary worlds satisfy real psychological, even spiritual needs, and at their best perform a kind of repair upon the world-weary. That would be J.R.R. Tolkien's 1939 address on fairy stories. And now I'm going to have a little water. Right, we're moving from MacDonald to Tolkien. I get to breathe. Okay. I admit that pivoting now to Tolkien may feel a little bit of a detour from the direction in which this lecture was heading. So let me spell out what I'm attempting to do. MacDonald provides a compelling paradigm for understanding the function of the imagination within the triangle of human creature, us, creation, and creator. But his model, enticing as it is, runs up against the jagged edges of our broken world. Creation may be glimmering, or at least it is in some spots, but fallen creatures as we are, we may not have the eyes to see its light, and even if we do, the powers to express its meaning. The fallen world is too much with us. We may thus benefit by building and visiting other regions, necessarily fabricated out of the stuff of this world, in which the imagination may have free play. That power, the power of sub-creating a world, the philologist Tolkien insisted on calling fantasy, as opposed to the mental activity of, quote, forming mental images of things not actually present, which he considered the proper business of imagination. This fantasy, on Tolkien's telling, encompassed both the creative, air quotes, work of making art out of materials of the primary world, but nonetheless not restricted to the way of the world as we experience it. Such a story, in Tolkien's ideal, will be wonderful and unafraid of its wonders, just as a fairy tale, his ideal form, is, but at the same time, as Tolkien goes on to argue, marked by its own internally consistent laws. Against the cultured despisers of fairy tales, especially those who would mock adults who delight in them, the professor counters that expeditions into such speculative realms offer psychological goods that people of all ages, and perhaps adults most of all, desire. He specifically names three: recovery, escape, and consolation, though I think there's really a fourth, which I want to call fruition. Let's review them quickly. Recovery describes the restoration of our tired eyes and other senses through contact with fantastic elements. Having confronted centaurs and dragons, we may reawaken to the wondrous facts around us. The childlike, quote, clear view that Tolkien mentions on this slide sounds to me like glimpses of the beaming universe in MacDonald's sights. Now to escape. With escape, Tolkien means to praise the reprieve that fantastic literature offers from the tyranny of what other people take to be real life, however ugly, short-sighted, and degraded it might be. Quote, the maddest castle that ever came out of a giant's bag in a wild Gaelic story is not only much less ugly than a robot factory. Tolkien hates robots. It is also, to use a very modern phrase, in a very real sense, a great deal more real. And of course, as this slide suggests, there are worse things than robot factories from which we might seek temporary respite. Fairy stories console, Tolkien argues, by showing us the satisfaction of ancient desires, such as the possibility of escaping death. But the most important consolation that fairy stories offer in Tolkien's mind is the consolation of the happy ending. For in that consolation, there is an inkling that history itself may take a different direction than the long defeat we might assume. This Tolkien famously dubbed the eucatastrophe, or the good catastrophe. In this respect, above all, a fantastic story may be, on the professor's reckoning, a, quote, far-off gleam or echo of Evangelion, good news, in the real world. I believe, as I have said, that Tolkien posits another function of fantasy for which I think fruition is an apt word. For fruition meant enjoyment long before it gained its now familiar sense of bearing fruit. Tolkien speaks of it both ways. Like the other Wade authors, Tolkien speaks of fantasy, or creative imagination if you prefer, as not just a faculty but a gift that we exercise in imitation of the giver. It's just something we need to do. And in doing it, we enjoy ourselves. And what's more, that exercise may perhaps, and here I am looking to the second quotation on the slide, participate in the effoliation, or stripping away of dead leaves, and multiple enrichment of creation. That claim, alas, appears at the very end of On Fairy Stories, leaving us, or at least your lecturer, desperately wanting a few paragraphs more. What do you mean, Ronald? Where are you going with this? Don't let it end. How far can we take that suggestion? Does it apply only to life on this side of the grave? Or does the imagination, this decisive human quality for Tolkien, have some role to play in the new creation? Tolkien left us a tantalizing hint in the form of a story called Leaf by Niggle, in which a frequently distracted artist lovingly renders the leaves of an imagined tree only to encounter that tree in a seemingly post-mortal forest bearing resemblances to the earthly paradise of Dante's Purgatorio, which is why I like it, before heading up into the mountains beyond. But the question, of course, the story poses is, did he see the tree, or did he write the tree? Or paint the tree? I want to suggest now that if we put MacDonald and Tolkien together, we may push both of their arguments further still, past MacDonald's romantic earth, past Niggle's Dantean forest, right up to the gates of the New Jerusalem. So here are my three speculations. We come to the speculative part of today's talk. 1. The new heaven and new earth will present an environment perfectly fitted to the redeemed human mind and body and the new humanity to that environment. I'm pushing Wordsworth into Revelation. In this new way of being, the imagination will enjoy new liberty and power to pursue its dual functions that MacDonald outlined. First, of putting thought into form. Right? So amidst the new creation, we will at last be able to speak ourselves clearly. And finding out the divine imagination. In the new order, we'll have new powers to find out who God is through the things God makes, if not confront God directly. My point here is that MacDonald the Romantic may have been wrong, or at least wrong for most of us most of the time, about the relationship between imagination and its surroundings. But his imagination essay may help us to think about what thinking and speaking and meaning will be like in a world where sin makes no noise. If nothing else, MacDonald's observations remind us that the new heaven and a new earth will provide materials for metaphors we have never made, and thereby perhaps ways of speaking feelings we cannot now imagine, much less describe. In providing us with a new heaven and a new earth, MacDonald would point out, or so I think, God is providing for both the material and the mental welfare for our bodily resurrected selves. Like, we need a new environment in which to think and feel and be. Speculation 2. By cultivating the noble unrest of the imagination now, we may live into the condition of new heaven and earthlings. Here I want to borrow a remarkable comment that Sayers added to her translation of Inferno 4, explaining Dante's placement of the virtuous pagans in limbo. Quote, "It is the weakness of humanism to fall short of the imagination of ecstasy. At its best, it is noble, reasonable, and cold. And however optimistic about a balanced happiness in this world, or we might say now, a certain repose, it is pessimistic about a rapturous eternity. So don't seek repose. Prepare your imagination for a better world." Speculation 3. Speculative literature has a privileged role to play in that process. While all of these speculations are debatable, of course, the last, I think, needs a little bit more explaining. So here goes. Speculative literature has a privileged role to play in that preparatory process because At its best, speculative literature invites us into alternative modes of thinking, knowing, and relating, ways of being that, one, exercise the imagination of both maker and audience. And one thing that I was thinking about as I prepared this talk, speculative realms, really successful, highly realized one, give us materials that add to our stock of analogies and metaphors. Thus, we can speak about the time we spent in Gondor or in Narnia as a place that we can draw strength from. Two, speculative literature jostles us from our unthinking acceptance of the world as it is currently ordered and experienced in its fallenness, and thereby reminds us of the contingency of this world, our place in it, and our experience of it. Thus, my sense of the mantra of speculative literature, things could be otherwise. And finally, and most provocatively of all, speculative literature may just offer preludes of our new condition. You are likely wondering if I am making this claim on behalf of speculative literature per se, as if any literary project pitched on the edges of what if will have these beneficent effects. I answer, of course not. MacDonald and Tolkien would caution us against such an all-embracing move, both being very much concerned with the moral content of fairy tales and their own tales, and the latter author would have balked at my effort to corral fantasy and sci-fi in a single pen, right? No robots. So discernment still matters. Had I more time, right, if Jim weren't such a cruel taskmaster who only gave me a few minutes, I work in hours, man, right? Had I more time to offer a demo reading of stories by non-Christian writers, I really would have liked to talk about Ted Chiang's short story, The Story of Your Life, the basis of the film Arrival. But given where this lecture is happening and the very few minutes remaining, I'll stick with a player for the home team, C.S. Lewis. I don't have time to do the passages that I'm about to cite justice. So consider what I'm about to say the directions for a homework assignment. And given how many of you people were my students, you should do this, right? Go revisit or pay your first visit to the endings of Perelandra and the Last Battle. We'll skip over that one. That's where Lewis tells me not to do this. All right. If you do, you might notice how, in the case of Perelandra, Lewis uses the elaborate imagery of the Great Dance, which is a remarkable amalgam of medieval and modern cosmology, and tangled sentence structures to drive our imaginations beyond our ordinary mode of being. I'm using my time, Jim. All right. The whole solid figure of these enamored and interanimated circlings was suddenly revealed as the mere superficies of a far vaster pattern in 4 dimensions. And that figure is the boundary of yet others and other worlds, till suddenly as the movement grew yet swifter, and the interweaving yet more ecstatic, the relevance of all to all yet more intense, right? That sense that there's a single imagination behind everything. As dimension was added to dimension, and that part of him which could reason and remember was dropped farther and farther behind that part of him which saw. Even then, at the very zenith of complexity, complexity was eaten up and faded, as a thin white cloud fades into the hard blue burning of the sky, and a simplicity beyond all comprehension, God's embrace, ancient and young as spring, illimitable, pellucid, drew him with chords of infinite desire. And it's a wonderful slight ambiguity there. Whose chords of desire are drawing? Into his own stillness, its own stillness. He went up into such a quietness, a privacy, and a freshness that at the very moment when he stood farthest from our ordinary mode of being, he had the sense of stripping off encumbrances and awakening from trance and coming to himself. We go from there. And when you read Lewis's description of the friend's arrival to the new Narnia at the end of the Last Battle, you may be struck by the way Lewis, who had read MacDonald's imagination essay with great care, you can look at his annotations, explains the difference between the new Narnia and the old. The difference between the new old Narnia and the new Narnia was like that. The one was a deeper country. Every rock and flower and blade of grass looked as if it meant more. I can't describe it any better than that. If you ever get there, you will know what I mean. And you may notice, too, that this book contrives to show us a new mode of being, one where you can go up and up and up with all kinds of reflected light flashing on you from the water and all manner of colored stones flashing through it, till at last it seems as if you are climbing light itself. Now, even with such a perfunctory review of the two endings, you'll notice that Lewis has two imagined scenarios. One presents a moment of solitary communion that seems to take us right out of the universe, into the mind of God, the heart of God, God's embrace. The other, communal play within an apparently endless creation. You can always go further up and further in. Well, which is it? It is a testament to the strength of Lewis's imagination that he doesn't pick. Though there are commonalities in both cases, Lewis's characters, for example, are inquiring into the things that God made, experiencing recovery, encountering meanings in greater density than we can now imagine. Heaven, it has often been said, is more than we can imagine. I reply, more than you can imagine right now. Let our imaginations not be idle as we prepare for what's next. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions. And while you think of your questions, I just encourage you to come back to the Wade and you can look at that book. I would ask that nobody look at it right now, but it does have Lewis's annotations in it. It's a really fantastic thing. I'm going to come around with the mic, and you can ask your questions of Dr. Gibson.
Of course you would ask the first question. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
You should introduce yourself. Who are you?
I'm Brett. I was your student 10 years ago. So,
Hey, buddy.
I think I sort of agree,
Okay, great.
but I sort of want to argue the contrary and see what you'll say.
Okay.
So, end of Job,
Yes.
there's God's speech.
Yes.
And God challenges Job that he seems to be sort of imagining that if there were just the world, more or less the same except without Job's suffering, it would be perfect.
Yes.
And when God challenges him, he says, look, you need to imagine everything that seems incorrect as part of what makes this world beautiful.
Yeah.
And everything that seems incorrect in the normal thing, the Revelation picture, ordinary Bible eschatology, is in fact what's gone, right? Pain and... But,
Things are burned away.
but in Job, it has... Why is it like the gazelle child getting up and running away from its mother right after she's gone through labor for it? Why is like a vulture feeding its young from dead corpses? Why is the ostrich so stupid it can't lay its eggs where they won't get stepped on? And the whole point seems to be like, you really can't imagine a better world than the violent, seemingly pointless, evil world that you live in. So why do you say otherwise? Why do you think that you can kind of imagine towards a more consistently perfect world?
Yeah. I like that as a question. So first of all, there's two things I want to say. First one is, I think we're also committed. So I find MacDonald's paradigm in this particular essay a little too innocent. That's what I was trying to suggest. That it's taking a bit too much from Wordsworth in particular, who Wordsworth just, in my own reckoning, never fully confronted original sin. So that was part of my critique of MacDonald. Now, as Christians, I think we're also committed to a vision of the Felix Culpa, which is all over Paralandra, right? So there's this fall, but it's fortunate because it makes the resulting picture even more beautiful. So I just wanted to add that as you're talking about Job, that we don't want to deny that the fall actually has just totally corrupted the picture. We want to say that it's changed the picture and there's a new resulting beauty. Okay, now your question is, I'm trying to state this back to you, and if I'm not doing it well, you repeat it. So your question is, based on the Jobian picture of the limitations of the human imagination, like why do I have any confidence that our imaginations can get any better?
Or,
Something like that?
or why would you be able to imagine perfection given the
Yeah.
limitations
Yeah.
when perfection seems, the goodness of imagination
Yeah.
seems to derive from
This world that's,
imagining
yeah.
the world
Yeah.
according to its imperfections.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I think that's a totally fair critique. And I would say I believe in sanctification. So I think that we are becoming more and more like God. And in that respect, I think our imagination can become more and more like God's. And I would say in the operation of a sanctified imagination, it becomes increasingly capable of discerning where the goodness of God is. But, and I think this is really important, I think our stories still need to acknowledge our finitude. Right? So Aquinas, in his great Prayer Before Study, talks about the double darkness in which we're born, that of sin and ignorance. And I think both of those things need to factor in. So like we're never really going to be able to imagine a heaven on our own. We need God to imagine that for us. God has to make the new creation. My point is about our ability to respond to it. I feel like very strongly convinced that the imagination will thrive in the new order. And I like MacDonald's way of thinking about the way in which part of the problem that we're constantly confronting is we're looking at it on this abundance, but we can't quite take it in the right way to both describe it, but also to describe ourselves. And so a new possibility of encountering God's immanence in a new creation while also in God's company feels to me like the perfect playland for the imagination, like the environment where it belongs. Yeah. Oh man, not another one of you people. Another former student.
Yes.
Like the tables have turned.
So I guess to put it in a glib sense, is there room for robots in this sort of speculative imagination? And to be a little less glib about it, is science fiction part of this kind of speculative literature? Even the Space Trilogy, which I only actually read the first two a long time ago, but the technology seems to be associated with the bad guys, not
the bad guys are making spaceships, Well, so this is actually why I wanted to talk about the story of your life, which I think is just like, it's a remarkable example of speculative literature that's taking advantage of the alien visit as its jumping off point for thinking about different ways of experiencing time, reality, the coherence of events and like our ways of ordering the phenomena we experience. So I actually am happy to include sci-fi, unlike Ronald. But I think you're right to say like Lewis's version of sci-fi is different than the kind of standard version of sci-fi. And we should acknowledge that. But I also think Lewis's version of sci-fi allows him to get cosmic, which I think can be a limitation of fantastic settings, right? Especially if your fantastic setting is set in the Middle Ages, as other people we know and whose books are around tend to do. Like there's a way that they can get cosmic, but they're also working off old cosmologies, whereas Lewis is trying really hard at the end of Paralandra to take some of the new cosmology, the new way of understanding the universe that he's reading about in magazines, and he's trying to bring that into contact with old ideas about what lies behind the universe or permeates the universe. So I like sci-fi for that it's like it allows us to really consider new ideas about like how the universe is ordered. On robots, oh man. This would have been easier to talk about before 2018, right? Which is like when GPT-2 was really starting to take off. I'm just going to pass on that one, but I'll just say like it's fraught. It's definitely a fraught issue because it's not sci-fi now, right? Like we're really seriously debating like machine sentience and machine consciousness. So like we've moved from speculative literature on this front to something more like a real set of live intellectual questions, and for that we would need to talk about it at a different venue. Whitney wants to call. Yeah, of course I do. There's Peter. I know a lot of you people.
Another one of your students.
Yeah, hey man.
So kind of going off of that a little bit. So you use Christian authors
Yes.
pointing to the fulfillment, like new creation. What do you make of the role of speculative fiction?
Yeah,
still pointing to
so if I go back to my, sorry, I no longer have, oh yeah, I do have my slides. So, again, like Jim only lets me speak for 40 minutes. I have no idea how long I actually talked, but I was told we agreed on 40 minutes. I was actually like struck by the way in which the slides itself got shorter. And I think, oh, sorry, it's this one too. Like as you go down the list, I think that the set gets smaller. So I think a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, and other modes of speculative literature, including magical realism, like they have special ways of igniting our imaginations that are good, right? So if you buy my argument that like we should be spending our lives enriching our imaginations, then speculative literature of all kinds can be useful to us in that way. The second point, I think, generally holds for speculative literature, that any kind of mode of literary experience that jostles us from just assuming that the dreary world around us is all that there is, that there's only one way to order a society, that there's only one way to be alive to the universe, is good. Right? And that's part of, if you read Tolkien's essay, that's part of what Tolkien's really concerned about. Like undergirding that piece is a way in which humans could just shrivel and diminish within the worst sides of modernity. And so he's looking at fairy stories and saying, look, read fairy stories. They'll bring you back to life. They will show you that the world around you that you accept as final is not final. That there's other ways that the world could be ordered and experienced. So I think a lot of speculative literature works very well in that vein, regardless of exactly what it's attempting to do. And then the last one, that one I would want to reserve for people like Lewis, although I don't know, right? We can be surprised by the outpourings of grace. Like we might encounter some moment that kind of helps us feel like we're getting into the closer to the terrain of this. Sorry, that's what I want. Right, in unexpected places. And this is the last thing that I'll say on this line. I've been struck by the ways in which coming out of reading certain kinds of speculative literature, revelation, not that it makes perfect sense, just makes more sense. It feels more alive to me. It's hard to then explain in normal discursive language, but nonetheless, something that's going on in this text reminds me of what I just encountered, or what I'm encountering in this text somehow makes more immediate sense to me, even if I can't quite explain it, regardless of whether it's written by an author who's endeavoring to be orthodox or not.
I am your timekeeper, and we have time for one more
Give
question.
it to her.
Hi,
Hey, pal.
Whitney. I was also 10 years ago. So, I can't believe that you haven't talked more about Dante. Because I read Dante's Paradise with you 10 years ago, and so that's it. I just want to give you some time to talk about Dante.
Well, let's go back to that list here. Okay, so let's just go back through all these. This will take 2.5 hours, and there'll be a 60,000-word monograph coming out soon. No, but I mean, in all, like, realistically, Dante is shaping all the things I'm doing. I mean, there's this kind of wonderful moment when Lewis is writing about Charles Williams after he died, and he refers to Williams and says, Dante was his master. Right? In the sense of a magister, like the great teacher. And so Dante's my great teacher. And I think you're exactly right. Like that Dante is occupied with these same concerns. Like, what kind of body will we have? Right? Because he's encountering disembodied souls, but he's thinking about like what comes next and what can we experience and how will we know each other? How will we know God in these settings? And he wants you to have a kind of noble unrest. That, like when you finish the Commedia, if you put it down and you're like, well, that's done. That hasn't worked. Like you should finish the Commedia and feel in awe of God. And then, I would like to say that Dante is probably the best medicine we have for the imagination. But you got to spend like 16 weeks reading it with me and Adam Wood to get that full message, I'd say. So thank you. Thanks for the setup.
Well, this is, you all know this, but C.S. Lewis said that MacDonald, reading Phantastes, baptized his imagination. And I feel like I'm a little bit closer to understanding that. So thank you, Dr. Gibson. Let's thank him. All right, we are dismissed October 9th, Tisch Harrison Warren in Armerding. See you there.